More than 1 month into Iran's war, Mojtaba Khamenei was still inside the country and still not appearing in public, with his disappearance waved away as something understandable. That is not a normal wartime detail. That is the kind of sentence a regime uses when it needs authority to remain alive, but does not want anyone studying the condition of the man carrying it. And when Iran finally heard from its new supreme leader, it still did not hear him. His first message was delivered by a state TV presenter, which means the first real test of succession ended with the regime. Showing a script, not a ruler, that is where the surface story dies. Then came the part that makes the whole picture uglier. Senior Iranian sources said the Revolutionary Guards forced Mojtaba Khamenei through as supreme leader. So the man who still has not appeared was not simply inherited by the system. He was pushed into place by the armed corps most capable of carrying a war under his name. If you want the version of the story that starts where the headlines get nervous, subscribe now and drop this in the comments. Before we go deeper, if a regime shows you the orders but hides the ruler, are you looking at control, fear, or a coup in slow motion? The first major wartime message in Mojtaba's name was read out on state television rather than delivered live or on video. That difference is lethal. A live address proves presence, nerve, and personal command. A written missive proves only that somebody inside the state wants his authority stamped onto a decision without exposing the man himself. That is why the title's second half matters more than most people realize. Written orders now carry Iran's war is not poetry, it is mechanism. The paper does the work the body cannot safely do. The text threatens, mobilizes, warns, and legitimizes while the ruler remains physically absent from the scene he is supposed to dominate. And once a regime discovers that this works, it starts solving a different problem. It is no longer racing to reassure the public with a proof of life image. It is testing whether the office of supreme leader can keep functioning as a source of command even when the human being inside that office cannot be shown, should not be shown, or is no longer the full center of gravity. That is the deeper reason this story feels wrong. The audience clicked because they sensed a gap. A normal succession in wartime would overcompensate with visibility. A frightened system might still force out a controlled appearance. But this regime chose the opposite move. It decided that the title, the seal, and the written line were enough to keep the war politically alive. That choice became easier because Mojtaba was already a secretive figure inside the Islamic Republic before the war ever pushed him upward. He disappeared from public view right after the strike. Yes, but he was never a mass-stage leader to begin with. He was a shadow operator, elevated into the one office that usually depends on visible embodiment. That matters because it changes the psychology of the transfer. The regime did not lose a public ruler and replace him with another public ruler. It lost a figure whose power had ritual weight, then installed a man whose power was always more hidden, more clerical, more backroom, and far easier to route through documents, emissaries, and institutions. For the men beneath him, that is useful. A silent, unseen supreme leader does not compete with the machinery that claims to serve him. He does not overshadow the armed networks, the decision rooms, or the security elite. He can remain supreme on paper while the apparatus below him grows louder, harder, and more indispensable in practice. So when viewers ask the real question behind the title, if Mojtaba still has not appeared, who is carrying the war? The answer is already beginning to take shape. The war is being carried by his authority in writing, by the structures below him in motion, and by a regime that may now need the symbol of supreme rule more than the visible act of supreme leadership. The official line went even further. All actions and attacks were being carried out with his direct permission and orders. If that is fully true, then Iran is deliberately fighting a war behind a ruler it refuses to show, which turns invisibility itself into policy. If that is not fully true, then the sentence is more revealing still, because it means written permission is now being used to bless actions generated somewhere lower and harder inside the state. That is the dual truth at the center of everything. Either Mojtaba Khamenei is actively authorizing a war while remaining hidden from his own public, or his authority is being used as the legal religious wrapper for decisions made by men whose Names do not appear at the top of the page. Both possibilities are dangerous. Neither one gives the viewer the comfort of normal command. And this is exactly where weaker scripts go soft. They start debating hospital rumors, bunker rumors, facial injury rumors, as if one medical answer will resolve the whole story. It will not. Because even if you walked on camera tomorrow, looking perfectly intact, the regime has already demonstrated something bigger than his condition. It has demonstrated that it can keep a war moving, while the public never sees the person supposedly directing it. That is what should bother a serious audience. Not mystery for its own sake. Not gossip disguised as strategy. The problem is that Iran's war is being carried through a layer of written authority, thick twine act, enough to hide what is actually happening at the top without interrupting what is happening below it. By the time the war moved toward a temporary ceasefire phase, Mojtaba still had not been seen or spoken in public since the start of the conflict. That single fact destroys the lazy version of this story. Iran was not just enduring shock. It was threatening, bargaining, maneuvering, and adjusting course while the supreme leader remained publicly voiceless and visually absent. Think about what that means. If the regime's first priority had been restoring visible continuity, it had a simple option. One short recording, one tightly controlled appearance, one image with the right lighting and the right script. That would have cooled the rumor mill overnight. The fact that Tehran still did not spend that card tells you the regime judged the risk of showing him to be greater than the risk of letting the world wonder who was really steering. That is not a small choice. That is the choice that transforms absence into evidence. It tells you the hidden state of things may be politically more combustible than the speculation outside. It tells you the cameras become dangerous territory. And in a war like this, when a regime avoids the camera, it is often because the image would reveal more than the words can safely contain. So no, the viewer did not click to hear that security concerns explain everything. The viewer clicked because deep down, the sentence already sounded false on its own. The country at war does not keep its new supreme leader unseen for this long unless the unseen condition itself has become part of how power is being managed. Even the Nowruz message followed the same pattern. Mojtaba Khamenei still had not been seen in public since replacing his slain father. Yet another written statement was used to project resolve and continuity. So by that point, the absence was no longer a transition glitch. It was becoming the operating method. That is a crucial escalation layer because it tells us the regime did not treat public invisibility as a temporary embarrassment. It normalized it. It allowed the supreme leader's role to be performed through attributed texts, while the state kept asking for obedience, sacrifice, endurance, and national cohesion from a population that still had not seen the man meant to embody all of it. Once that pattern locks in, written orders stop looking like placeholders. They become the transport system for power. They carry anger without exposing weakness. They carry threats without exposing fear. They carry doctrinal certainty without exposing human fragility. And in a war state, that is an enormous advantage if your top symbol has become too vulnerable to display. This is why the story widens beyond Tehran. Any rival reading Iran has to ask the same thing the audience is asking. Are we dealing with a hidden sovereign who is still making the calls, or are we dealing with a hardened machine that can continue operating under his name even if his personal capacity is reduced? Either answer changes how deterrence works. Neither answer makes Iran easier to predict. And that is where the title's promise really lands. Written orders now carry Iran's war means the war has entered a phase where text itself is doing strategic labor. The messages are not background noise. They are the bloodstream, connecting legitimacy at the top to motion underneath. Then came the most important proof point of all. Sources familiar with the talks described Mojtaba Khamenei's approval for the ceasefire as a breakthrough. That matters because it shows the office still had enough weight that a major strategic shift either required his actual consent or at least required the state to say it did. That is the answer to the audience's click question in its sharpest form. Who is carrying Iran's war? Not Mojtaba alone as a visible commander standing before the nation. The war is being carried by a hybrid structure. His written authority, the armed and security corps beneath him, and the institutional machinery that still needs the supreme leader's blessing on paper, even when it does not or cannot put him on camera. If his approval was real in the fullest sense, then Iran has chosen a terrifying model of hidden wartime sovereignty. A man no one sees can still authorize escalation or de-escalation from behind layers the public never enters. But if his approval functioned more as a necessary stamp than as the sole source of strategy, then the state has drifted into something more militarized and less transparent. Operational power below, supreme legitimacy above, and written orders binding the two together. That is why the ceasefire does not soften this story, it hardens it. A war machine that can threaten under unseen authority is one thing. A war machine that can also tactically pause, bargain, and reposition under unseen authority is something more. Disciplined and more durable. It means the system did not just survive decapitation, it adapted. And when systems adapt like that, the public face matters less than outsiders expect. The leader's body stops being the only site of sovereignty. Sovereignty gets distributed into documents, approvals, inner circles, and controlled minds of legitimacy that can keep flowing even when the visible top is cut off from the public. Inside Iran, people were already asking the question openly, and having not seen him since he was named leader, some were casting doubt on who was running the country. And that is the human anchor of the whole story. Ordinary people heard a presenter instead of a ruler and immediately understood that something fundamental had shifted in the way authority was being performed, and that human reaction matters because it cuts through all the jargon. People do not need a think tank brief to know when a government is asking them to accept too much on trust. They know the difference between being led and being managed. They know the difference between a leader speaking to a nation and a nation being handed a text and told that the speaker exists somewhere behind it. That is the feeling the title had to cash, and it is the feeling the regime cannot fully suppress. Even if loyalists stay loyal, even if state institutions keep functioning, even if military decisions still emerge with supreme authorization attached, a crack opens the moment citizens realize they are being asked to live through war under an authority they cannot physically verify, and that crack is not necessarily collapse. But it is revelation. It reveals that the system beneath the leader has become strong enough or ambitious enough or autonomous enough to carry the war through his absence. It reveals that written legitimacy is now doing the emotional and political work that visible command used to do. So when people ask whether Mojtaba's absence means weakness, the better answer is this. Not necessarily weakness, possibly something worse. Possibly a regime learning in real time that it can preserve coercion and hierarchy and strategic direction without giving the public access to the man whose title crowns all of it. That is why a skeptical viewer should not walk away, fixated only on wounds or rumors. The lasting significance is structural. Iran may be entering a phase where the supreme leader's office matters more than the supreme leader's presence, and where the security state can keep moving under written sanction while the human figure at the top becomes ever more remote, protected, and politically untouchable. If that is the direction, then the implications stretch far beyond this one war. A system that can hide its ruler and still wage conflict is harder to read, harder to pressure, and harder to destabilize through spectacle alone. You cannot study body language that is never shown. You cannot measure confidence from a voice you never hear. You are left reading decrees, movements, approvals, and outcomes. And that is the final hard answer this audience came for. Mojtaba Khamenei still has not appeared because at this stage, appearance may no longer be the regime's priority or even its need. What it needs is the authority attached to his office, the written orders that carry that authority forward, and the men below him who can keep translating those orders into war. If he is fully active, then Iran has weaponized invisible leadership. If he is only partially active, or if others are carrying the heavier operational burden while his name seals the process, then Iran has already become more militarized and more opaque than the official story admits. Either way, the conclusion stands. The war did not wait for Mojtaba Khamenei to show his face. It learned how to move without it. And that should sit in the viewer's gut long after this video ends. The most chilling fact is not that the new supreme leader stayed hidden. It is that the state kept fighting through paper, approval, and fear while he did. Stay close, because the next stage of a story like this is never announced when it begins.